affecting millions. Since the end of World War II, everybody has been saying never again and never forget, and it sounds great, but what's happened since the end of World War II? 100 million, I repeat, deaths have occurred due to genocide. So we need to take conferences like these. We need to take good books like the one that Dr. Lauer is going to speak about. We need to read them. We need to listen to people. We need to think and then act in order to mitigate and stop what is this scourge of mankind. So what I'm going to do now is introduce Dr. Lauer, and we will have her speak. And after that, we will then have a Q&A session of about 10, 15 minutes, however many minutes we have left. So if you do have questions, would you please put them into chat or into Q&A, please? Okay. Dr. Lauer, with whom I worked before and have heard speak in DC and Phoenix and elsewhere, she is the director of the, if I can pronounce this correctly, Mgrublian Center for Human Rights, and the John K. Roth Professor of History and the George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. She served as acting director of Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum from 2016 to 2018. She is the chair of the museum's academic committee. Her numerous publications include Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in the Ukraine, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in nonfiction and translated into 23 languages. And her most recent book to come out is this book, The Ravine. I cannot urge you enough to buy this book and read it. It is excellent. And I'm not going to take up time. I'm not going to take time away from Wendy because we want to hear her talk about this book. So Wendy, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, John, so much for this invitation. Thank you, all of you in the Scottsdale area. I was in Arizona last January, actually, before we were all quarantined. So it was actually one of the last trips I made in 2020. So I'm back. And for some of you, I actually gave you a little bit of preview of this book. But I'm just delighted to be part of this program, and I appreciate all the organizational effort that went into this program. It's very ambitious under these circumstances, and I think it just demonstrates the commitment to studying this history and preventing genocide in the future. And all of you who are attending believe in that. You're here. You've chosen to attend this talk, and I just appreciate that very much. Thanks to the crew, John and Matt and all of you for bringing this all together. So let me start a little bit with my book, The Ravine, and why I wrote the book, some of the highlights of the book, and read a little bit from the book, and definitely leave enough time for questions at the end. The book focuses on a photograph, and I'd like to share my screen with you. And I also want to warn you that it's a very disturbing photograph. It is, in my view, an image that captures genocide in its most extreme form. We're going to look at it in a moment. It's a photograph that shows the act of murder, the murder of a Jewish family. Now, we've all seen how one photograph of suffering or violence can move audiences and propel humanitarian action and social justice. Iconic images of atrocities, like a naked girl fleeing a napalm attack in Vietnam, a little Syrian boy, his name was Alan Kurdi, the little boy in the red t-shirt whose corpse washed up on the beach in Bodrum, Turkey. A Jewish Holocaust victim kneeling over a pit in Ukraine in 1941 with a gun to his head, or the images of railway lines leading to the entrance of Birkenau or the gate at Auschwitz. These images become part of our collective memory of particular historical disasters, yet they are widely circulated and displayed with little information, usually about the circumstances or persons pictured in them, and usually even less about the photographer. Images like these that you're hopefully familiar with, images of Anne Frank. Here's the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. This is this famous picture, which is displayed at Yad Vashem and is often kind of a go-to image in mass media for the Holocaust, certainly the Holocaust by bullets. That's called The Last Jew in Vinica. This little boy here with his hands raised, coming out of the Warsaw Ghetto, that was in the Stroop album. The SS commander of the liquidation of the ghetto memorialized that in his album for his boss, Heinrich Himmler. Here is the liberation of Buchenwald with Elie Wiesel looking from the bunk. Of course, these images of corpses, of bones. This is also taken in Ukraine, a family on the run being gunned down by ZIPO SD, by security service killers attached to the Einsatzgruppen in southern Ukraine. As an historian of the Holocaust, I was especially concerned about the lack of research on rare photographs that were used as standard illustrations, but not studied as historical documents. I knew that most graphic images were the subject of scholarly debates about what should or should not be displayed, but what were the rules about what should be studied and how should it be researched? What were the ethics and methods of that inquiry? I had written books that privileged the use of Nazi documentation, and then another book about a single victim's diary, and started to think about whether visual evidence, including a single photograph, could open up new lines of inquiry and discovery about the Holocaust. And some of this thinking emerged in my time at the museum in DC, and seeing, what was on display, observing visitors, going through the exhibits, going through the photo archives and looking at the captions and the material there. Even in my own books, publications, when it came time to find illustrations, just the manner in which illustrations were kind of brought in and just printed, sometimes with or without captions, as I mentioned. And in my teaching, when I would be showing PowerPoint slides with certain images, how students would respond to them. And so this was part of a kind of moment in my research and teaching when I thought I'd like to do more on photography and on how we represent genocide through this medium. And it was about this time, actually, when two journalists from Prague came to the museum in DC, and it was 2009. And I was working there on another case. I was actually investigating a living perpetrator in Frankfurt, who was in Frankfurt. I wasn't there doing work on photography. And in fact, I was still writing Hitler's Furies. In any event, the journalists came to the museum. They had this photograph, which I'm going to show to you. And while I was at the microfilm reader, my colleague came up to me, knew I was there, and I worked on Ukraine, my colleague Vadim Altskan, and he said, I think you should take a look at this photograph. And this was the photograph. And it still shocks me. I've been working on it since then. So I realize that for those of you who have not seen this photograph, that it is quite startling, quite graphic. So what is it about this photograph that really gave me pause and really convinced me that I should work on it in more depth? When you look at this photograph, you can see that it is one of the Holocaust. You can recognize the Nazi uniforms, the wartime era clothing of the European civilians, the old rifles, the boy with his family being shot by Germans, local collaborators at the edge of what looks like a ravine. Now, I had seen thousands of photographs and closely studied hundreds, but there were very few that actually captured the killers in the act. And there were very few that actually showed, in this case, Ukrainians and Germans side by side carrying out the mass murder in close range, a stable, clear image, even composed. You can see the aesthetic here of the kind of rule of thirds and the dimensions and the way it's cropped, that this is something that was taken by someone probably openly, not clandestinely. A single photograph like this was incontrovertible evidence. It was for me, and literally, as you see, the smoke in the middle of a smoking gun. There aren't actually that many photos that show this, this moment of murder in our archive of Holocaust imagery, which is, as I mentioned, vast. I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of actual photo albums in the archives, and hundreds of thousands of images that have been digitized. The journalist told me when they came with this photograph and presented it to me with Vadim, and we sat around and we were studying it and talking about it, and they showed me that it had been taken, they had some basic information, it had been taken on October 13th, 1941. They came from Prague because actually the photograph had been taken by a Slovakian who was in the security services. It was part of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, in the summer of 1941. That was a fully collaborative military campaign that was led by the Germans, as you know, but also involved the Romanians and the Croatians and the Hungarians, Slovakians, Spanish expeditionary forces, and others. So here we have a Slovakian photographer. They had his name. He had been questioned about it in 1958. So they had an interrogation report from the photographer, also very unusual. So we have a place, Mariupol, Ukraine, about 100 miles west of Kiev, in what was historically the Jewish Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. So one of a kind of classic shtetl, that was the location. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a slide of Mariupol, and we're going to journey back there in our research on this photograph that I'm going to walk you through. So I have the name of the photographer, the date, and the location of the actual image. Now, as I studied it and started to think about how to approach it, with my colleagues, actually, we talked about this. We looked at the different elements, and then I asked my tech support team back at Claremont McKenna to create these kinds of what I call kind of cutouts of the different pieces that could be pulled out of the image and studied in more depth, such as the shoes. And the fact that shoes, empty shoes, are very much a part of how we memorialize and think about the Holocaust and the loss of life, and the silence that kind of remains in that absence, and the mystery of those shoes, who occupied those shoes. They look like men's shoes. They look like they've just been kind of taken off. There are papers or pieces of fabric near the shoes. If you zoom in, and we have the advantage of digital technology now in our research, you can zoom in, and I did a lot of zooming in and out to try to discern what was actually in the photograph, because not everything is visible at first glance. And in fact, you can see around the shoes there are bullet casings, a kind of litter of mass murder. And what about the fact that this is happening in broad daylight? That raises a lot of questions as far as witnesses in this community. It also, for me, opened up questions concerning the environment and the environmental history that is part of the Holocaust by bullets, in that whether ravines, the Germans used to put nature to work and used ravines and rivers and swamps to facilitate the carrying out of the mass murder. And in Father Desbois' book, In Broad Daylight, I think he makes a very important point as far as looking at the Holocaust by bullets as also another kind of machinery of destruction, in the way we think of the step-by-step killing and the process of gassing Jews. The Germans also developed a step-by-step they had their own way of organizing the mass shootings. That it was not often pogroms would accompany these mass shootings, precede them, but the actual shootings themselves were highly organized and involved the local population. What about the killers? What if the killers might still be alive? That was something I was very keen on determining from the beginning, because this was such a strong piece of evidence. So many had gotten away with murder, and here was this, as you know, this smoking gun kind of piece of evidence. And I thought, well, I'm going to focus on the killers and prioritize finding them, because this might lead to justice for the victims, who clearly in this image we can see are not going to be, we cannot save them. They're doomed in this image. They're dying. In fact, there's another photograph that we'll look at later that I uncovered that actually shows the image of the victims in the pit that the photographer took, and you can actually see the victims in the pit, lying in the pit. And if you zoom in very closely, you can actually see the woman in the polka dotted dress there, which those polka dots are visible in the mass grave. And in fact, she's still holding the hand of that little boy when you look at the image from above. The fact that the woman here and this little boy, this barefooted boy, and eventually as I studied this more closely, I discerned that there's another child here falling from her lap. And that was very important because, again, unless you take the time to really study closely an image like this, you won't discover these other elements. And in this case, I didn't know that there was another child, that was another soul that was about to be, and another victim was about to be murdered there. And this is why she's kind of standing in this position. I studied the smoke, wondering what that might indicate as far as the number of victims and what was actually going on the part of the executioners here, the killers, how many were firing. Was there someone, here's the killer here with his hand forward. Is there another gun here that is expelling a bullet that's creating this smoke and this kind of halo effect of this smoke? And that was another avenue for my kind of detective work on this. And this is the full image. Here is the photographer Lubomir Skrovina and his camera. And this thing that was really quite remarkable about this story of this photograph in my new book is that the photographer turns out to not be the person I thought he was. And so again, looking closely at these images, we discover more facts as far as how many people were killed and what happened. But we also start to discover that what we think we certain assumptions that we have in this history are actually wrong. First of all, the photograph was not taken at a ravine. I thought it was taken at a ravine because this was a common use of the natural landscape, the topography of Ukraine on the part of the Germans. And of course, most of you are probably familiar with what happened in Babi Yar in September 41. The Babi Yar is the larger ravine, the largest ravine outside of Kiev that we know of, was put to use for these mass murder operations. So it turns out it wasn't a ravine. The site there was actually dug out by Jewish men, including perhaps the man who wore those shoes. I don't know, but also local Ukrainian peasant women were brought in to dig that pit for that mass murder operation. And the photographer, as it turns out, although he was in uniform and he was the scribe for a security, as I mentioned, Slovakian security unit that happened to be stationed in Mariupol in October 1941, he was a hobby photographer as well, and he was someone who absolutely detested the war, was anti-fascist, was actually not a very political figure to begin with, was about 25 years old and had been drafted and deployed into service, and arrived on the scene on that day, according to his testimony. He heard the bullets, he heard the screams, the commotion coming from the forest, and his commander said, "Go check it out." And he went to the scene with at least one other Slovakian comrade. And because he was in uniform, he was able to pull out his camera and did not encounter any kind of resistance or any kind of objection on the part of the Germans. That he should be prevented from taking these pictures. And it's an interesting moment historically in the history of photography as far as the rise of the handheld portable camera and how important this was for all of us, obviously for history, because you have more, like we have today with social media, many more individuals who can respond at these sites, at these moments of human rights violations, at these moments of genocide, of violent conflict, war, can pull out their camera and document in real time these kinds of action shots for us as evidence of what happened. So the Leica pocket camera, this is a Zeiss icon, but the Leica had been patented in 1925. And the Zeiss icon hit the market in 1933. 10% of German population owned cameras. And during the war, Goebbels embedded 15,000 photojournalists and produced in all theaters about 3.5 million images. So Corporal Skrovina stands about 20 feet from the executioners. He didn't have a zoom or telephoto lens. And he's circulating among the gravediggers and the other witnesses. And he's just able to take these pictures openly. But he's doing it, although the victims obviously were not aware of this, if they even noticed, he's doing it as an act of resistance. For the victims, he's another man in uniform humiliating them with his camera. But in fact, he's going to take these pictures and bring them back to his home country, which Slovakia, back to Banska Bystrica, which was a center of Slovakian resistance during the war, and join that movement with these photos in hand. And he would actually take the photo that we're looking at today that I researched and show that to Jews in the community who had not been deported. And this is now in 1942, 43, and into 44, as a warning to them that this is what's going to happen when you're sent east. A Jewish family he actually brought into his attic. One of them, the head of the male Jewish head of household in that family he brought in was an OBGYN, and he actually delivered his son, Lubomir's son, Lubomir Jr., was born in their house in 1943. And Lubomir brought that Jewish family to the woods in 1944 when the Germans occupied Slovakia, similar to what happened in Hungary, and were going to resume deportations of Slovakian Jews, and also the hunt for Jews who had fled into and had been hiding in the forest, including some of the Jews that Skrovina brought to the forest. He had a car, and he had a radio that he used for the resistance effort. He was honored after the war, not by Yad Vashem, but he was decorated by the Czechoslovak government for being in the resistance. And he donated his camera before he died. He died in 2005, and he donated his camera to the Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava, and wrote in that letter with his donation, and that's why I was able to find that camera, and that's why I have a picture of it here, that he donated it with the wish that the museum would actually exhibit the camera in conjunction with a general exhibition on the Holocaust. And there is an exhibit there on the Holocaust. It's rather small, but his camera is not included in that exhibit. Perhaps that will change now. So Mirapol is an historic space, a historic place, a historic Jewish settlement. Here it is right here. I'm just circling it in the middle, smack dab in the middle of Ukraine. Here's Kiev. Here's Galicia, Western Ukraine. But this is a map actually from the 17th century. Mirapol would not be really visible on the map of Ukraine today because it is such a small town. But in the 17th century, it was very important in Jewish history. By the time the Germans arrived in 1941, the population had decreased significantly through immigration in the late 19th century, through the devastation of the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution and the pogroms following the First World War. and then Jews who emigrated to the cities during the 1920s and 1930s. So it was reduced to about 1,200 Jews in the town when the Nazis arrived in 1941. But it held a very special place in the imaginations of Jews in the region and beyond, and even cinematically, extending beyond Eastern Europe, because there was in the 1930s a very famous cinematic film version of the Dybbuk, a Yiddish play that is performed regularly, and the actual setting of that play is the town of Mirapol, and Ansky, a famous ethnographer, had gone into this area, right before the First World War, and documented the history there as well in photographs that he collected. So it's an interesting and significant place as far as the setting of the photograph, and I draw on that in my presentation, The Ravine, in trying to understand what was lost and to try to portray what was lost. This is what Mirapol looks like today, and this was the center of town. Here is a monument to the Second World War, and I took this picture when I visited the first time in 2014. That's a kind of an empty champagne bottle there. And it's just striking to stand in this marketplace when I had seen images from the turn of the century, and just at how it was a bustling marketplace. It was a market town. There was actually historically, the Poles had ruled over this region longer than the Russians or the Soviets, and a Polish count lived in a fortress on the hill on top of the town over the river Sluch. There was a paper factory. This was all enclosed here with shops, and behind here there were a lot of Jewish homes, wooden homes, Jewish cemetery, and there's just the recollections in the literature of the life and the intersection weekly at the weekly bazaars of Ukrainians and Poles and Jews. I'm not saying it was not trying to present an overly rosy picture, because of course there were periods of conflict, and including pogroms, anti-Semitic violence. But by and large, a peaceful town. In fact, the word Mirapol, that means peace, center of peace. And now this is what it looks like today, that this is really the result of genocide, of Sovietization, of post-Soviet runaway inflation, and the fact that Ukraine is still at war with Russia, and the incredible stresses that has placed on that country as far as the people and their economy, and the ability to restore what was devastated in the 20th century, and continues to be. That sense of loss is still, I think, present in a place like Mirapol, and standing in this center. This is the same place where the Jews who are pictured in the town, who were photographed in that massacre in 1941, this is where they were forced to gather, and from here they were then marched and beaten along the way, and their possessions stolen from them. They were forced to stay overnight in the marketplace the night before the massacre, and then they were forced to walk down. You follow this arrow. Here's a sketch of Mirapol that the Soviets put together in their investigation of the crimes there, and they're forced, the Jewish victims, to walk, as you follow these arrows, here to this park. And here, if you can see my little cursor, this is where the picture where Skrovina photographed that Jewish family being murdered, right here. The estimates of those who were murdered that day run into about 200 to 300. It's not quite clear. What we do know is that the Nazis, when they organized this mass murder, this mass shooting, they miscalculated the number of Jews that they were going to kill, mismeasured the size of the pit that was dug, had to stop, interrupt the mass, the killing operation, and quickly dig more trenches because there were more victims than they had actually expected could be captured and brought to the site. The image here, this sketch, is important. I want to just point out that the Soviets, that the photograph was taken in 1941. It stayed in Prague. The photographer was interrogated about it first in 1943 when he went back home. He was denounced for having taken dangerous photographs, and he was able to get out of that, survive that interrogation, and go back home, remarkably. And then again in 1958, 59, he was questioned about this photograph by the kind of KGB authority now that had taken over now Soviet Czechoslovakia. So he managed to endure those interrogations and kind of die peacefully. He was not imprisoned for his service in the Slovakian military. But the photograph stayed with him, and it stayed in the archives. And so part of the story is about how, since this is an international crime, you have Ukrainian militia with German killers side by side and a Slovakian photographer, and it's taking place in Ukraine. And then we have Jewish victims, and that a few of the, there were one survivor of this massacre, Ludmila Blechman, who was still in Ukraine and also in Moscow, and then emigrated to Israel. You had Jewish families who had left Mariupol before the Holocaust, who were, eager to find out what happened to their relatives and searching for their relatives and pursuing justice. The Germans in the photograph, as it turned out, returned to Germany, and they were residing in what was West Germany, right? So the most important piece of evidence for this massacre, because in my research, I did not find Nazi documentation on this killing action. I went through the records of the German order police and SS. I thought that the Germans in the picture here were order police, or were they Einsatzgruppen? I was looking at their insignia and at their uniforms and determined that these were not order police uniforms. The sleeves were not correct. The insignia here was not correct. The epaulets, the shoulder markings, the collar, it didn't match up. It was not order police. It wasn't SS and police. So it turns out that the killers, the German killers, were from a regular, they were customs guards. They had not been trained to do this work. In fact, this killing squad right here, they're all volunteer. These Ukrainians had volunteered in the summer to be part of the militia, and they're wearing Red Army repurposed coats, and these are armbands here, and these are rifles. Actually, I'm not sure about these rifles, whether or not they're originally Soviet rifles or they were German weapons. In any case, these individuals here are coming together to participate in this act of anti-Semitic violence. They don't speak the same language. These Ukrainians are from the town. They knew the victims. They could call them out by name. These Germans just arrived on the scene from the Reich, as it were, from Germany proper, as customs guards. They're supposed to be checking packages at the local train station or in the post office. And what happened is in 1969, outside of Hanover, in January 1969, one of the members of this unit, of this German unit of customs officials, walks into a police station. His name is Hoffman, and he says, "I want to report a crime." And I reproduced the crime report in the book because I was so astounded by the fact that decades later, in this small town, someone would walk in, and the way it was described, the police person at the desk, the officer on duty, just pulled out one of these generic forms for reporting a crime, in which you just type up the victims, the location, and any other information about the person submitting testifying to it. So this very standard operating procedure now, the content of that form is about the Holocaust. It's about the crime committed in Mariupol, about Jews are identified as the victims. And so this was what started a very, and ultimately very perfunctory West German attempts to look into this denunciation of these customs guards who potentially had committed crimes during the Second World War in this very remote place in Ukraine. Actually, they misplaced it geographically. They said it was in Russia, which is why I couldn't find it at first. But that investigation yielded some really important testimonies, and some of the Germans were forthcoming about their comrades and their misdeeds. And then the story, came out in these testimonies that the SS had come in on the night before the mass murder. The mass murder here took place on a Monday, and SS officials came in from a neighboring town, and they walked into the canteen, the German canteen, and said, and these guys here were playing cards, they were playing Scott, and the SS officer said, why are there Jews in this town? We better, we're here to organize an action. We need to make this town free of Jews. And who would like to assist us in this? And these two men stood up and said, Jawohl, we volunteer, we're going to participate in this. And after this massacre, they went back to their barracks and they were reenacting how they doled out bullets against these Jewish victims. And they were excited and like bragging and boasting about what they had done. But that West German case went nowhere because, first of all, there wasn't, one could say, the political will. There was not enough evidence. There was no documentation on this to be found. What we had for evidence was sitting in Prague, and there was no effort to contact other countries or to go to Soviet Ukraine and do any kind of investigation. So it's a very thin file, but very valuable as far as the testimonies that did come out. And the fact that one could compare, as we do in the book, those statements of those Germans and the perjury, the lying, the outright denial of their role by stating that they weren't there or they didn't do any of the shooting, by minimizing the number of victims, and all kinds of different tactics for diverting, deflecting the prosecutors or the investigators, and just outright denial. But the photograph clearly contradicts many of the statements, and that was very important. So the photograph cannot be used in the West German pursuit of justice. It is not available to the Soviets, who are aggressively pursuing wartime collaborators, so-called traitors to the homeland. That would be these Ukrainian men here. And so initially, the Soviets, while they are able to immediately round up the policemen who remained in Mariupol, and they do mete out their justice very quickly, and publicly hang and actually they torture and then hang the Ukrainian policemen who are in town as soon as they reoccupy Mariupol in 44. And the Extraordinary Commission comes in and starts to collect some testimony and confirm that and find the actual mass shooting site. But these militiamen in this action are not apprehended. And it's not until the 1980s, during kind of perestroika, glasnost, during the kind of waning years of the Soviet Union, there's another drive to find these killers in these cases having to do with the Holocaust. And there is a prosecutor in the neighboring town of Zhytomyr who leads this case in Mariupol. And this map is something that was drawn up in conjunction with that case. And it's an incredibly thorough, in contrast to what occurred in Germany, an incredibly thorough investigation for this moment in the 80s. And they actually find these two Ukrainians who are pictured in the image, those killers. They find a third Ukrainian militiaman who's not in the photograph. And they forced them to retrace the steps of the victims, and they photographed them at the killing site as they're pointing out exactly what happened on that day. Two of the Ukrainian killers who are arrested in 1986 are given the death penalty, and they are executed by firing squad in January 1987. The third Ukrainian killer was a minor at the time of the war, so he was 17 years old, so he's given a 15-year sentence and sent into the Russian kind of inner prison system, Soviet system. And I was not able to determine what happened to him, but it's really quite amazing that in 1987, Ukraine got its independence in August 1991, and that this trial happens so close to that moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when I started to do my research in Ukraine, the first time I went was the summer of '92, and I drove along the highway right past Mariupol, not knowing that I was going to go back there and actually write a book about what happened there during the Holocaust. So what about the Jewish family? This was something that I was very keen on identifying that family, and incredibly difficult, obviously, because we don't see their faces, and it's hard to know when you look at these lists of victims, of which there are very few in the what we call the Holocaust by bullets. Every fourth victim of the Holocaust resided in what is the territory of Ukraine today. But about half of them, mostly children, have not been identified. And they are the missing. There are communities that were wiped out so thoroughly without a trace, without evidence, without survivors. You have communities with less than 1% survived. Who's going to come forward and register them as missing? And that reality to me was quite, realizing that was rather profound, that there were these victims in this photograph that I couldn't find anyone who had kind of registered them as missing. The list of victims for Mariupol is incredibly incomplete. If there were maybe 1,000 to 1,200 who died, I identified about 450 names, and some of these lists have duplicate names. And they are, pretty difficult to. I'm going to show you a typical list here. This is what the Soviet Extraordinary Commission drew up when they reoccupied, when the Soviets reoccupied, Russians came into Mariupol. And so this is what we're dealing with, is handwritten lists, and you can see birth dates, and you can see family clusters. And what I ended up doing was looking for families that had a child, a boy, who might be the age of that boy in the picture, because it's hard to determine how old the mother was, but you could determine that, a child of maybe born between like or 35 and 38. And that led me into Yad Vashem's pages of testimony. And as I was going through the reels there alphabetically, and I was getting up to here, Basel Yuk, I found a page of testimony that a Jewish survivor from Southfield, Michigan had submitted about her family members. She was a child during the war and had been evacuated. She was not there during the war, but when she came back with her family, was given this photograph photograph of her aunt, her father's sister, and her cousins. These are her two cousins. And she was a nurse, and she stayed behind to help care for the family. And this photograph of these women and children was taken in 1941. And this was what was left of this family. This is how they wanted to be pictured. They went into there was a Jewish photographer in Mariupol, and they went into the photo studio. And this, to me, was an amazing find to recover this family photograph, and to think about the importance of the family in the history of genocide. The family unit as the most core and fundamental unit of our existence, of how we're acculturated, how communities grow, and how victims experience the Holocaust, the decisions that they made, about their loved ones and how they made choices about, dying together or fleeing. All of the importance of that in the victim's experience, which had come up in the literature, obviously, books like Sophie's Choice and so forth. But then I started to more systematically go through the survivor testimony and look at just how key the family was to their experience. And on the other side of it, on the Nazi perpetrator literature, Nazi documentation and Hitler's genocidal intentions, how the family, as part of their racial ideology, was so critical. In the summer of 1941, Hitler told his Croatian ally, not one Jewish family is to be left on the continent of Europe. And his understanding of history, Hitler's, was that the Jews had been, expulsions had happened before in Europe in the 15th century, for instance, but he warned that they always come back and that the children avenge the murder of their loved ones. And even Himmler said this in the summer of 41, drive the women into the swamps, the Pripyat marshes. We do not want women and children. We don't want the sons rising up to avenge the murder of their fathers, of their parents. So one chapter in the book emphasizes this very important theme, I believe, of the family history and genocide during and after, of course, because of the transmission of this history for all those who experience it. This is an illustration to support my point about the importance of the camera during this time, war photography, but also we could, of photography of the genocide photography, which was something the Nazis tried earnestly to prevent. They issued numerous orders and tried to confiscate photographs, atrocity photographs, but they issued numerous orders as soon as the killing started in 41, that the soldiers should not be taking pictures of the atrocities. That was not the point. And here's a camera photograph, a camera advertisement in a Wehrmacht military magazine about the optical Panzer, and then the strength of this camera is going to endure the battlefield and the shrapnel and any of the warfare and the challenge of being in the trenches. It's a strong camera. Sorry. And this is an advertisement about how photos are a bridge between the home front and the battlefield. And this is Mirapol in 2014. I was standing in the marketplace here, and this is that path that I was showing you. This is where they were forced to walk down into the killing site. This was along the path. This is the police station where some Jews were forced to were incarcerated here while the killing action was taking place, and the Ukrainians were kind of dancing around this and around another shack where Jews were forced to give up their valuables, singing the funeral march. This is the Ukrainian militiaman who was the collaborator I mentioned, who's in the photo. This is the Soviet case, the investigation and the fingerprinting and the arrest file of one of the Ukrainian killers. And here's his mugshot, and it is the same man. If you look at these features, it is. I hope this. I'm sorry to go so quickly. It is this man here. This is the Yad Vashem page of testimony that I mentioned. This is what it looks like when it's filled out. And what was so astounding in this case was that family photograph that we were just looking at, that beautiful image of the Vasilyuk family, was attached to this testimony, and about less than 1% actually contained photographs. And that's what it looked like when I first saw it. And it just was startled to see that little boy's face that reminded me of the boy in the photo. And this is the survivor from Southfield, Michigan. And I met with her eventually and showed her the photograph, but she was too young. She could not As you've seen in the atrocity image there, we cannot see their faces, and she could not make with 100% certainty identify them. And she was actually very upset by the photograph and kind of turned her head and turned away, and I was not going to press her anymore. These are
About
Ukraine.
5 minutes, Wendy, okay?
Yeah. And these are the Ukrainian witnesses that we spoke to, about 18. I went to the site with the Yahad and Unum crew, with not with Father Desbois, but with some of his colleagues, with a film crew as well as interpreters, who showed me I wanted to see what their methods were in the field. I wanted to try to understand how they were collecting these testimonies, and provided them with all my material. We kind of use that as the basis for a more thorough on the ground investigation. And that was the summer of 2016. And we also retraced the steps and went back to the actual crime scene with Ukrainian witnesses who were very clear about what they had seen, what former peasant boys and girls who were, one woman who, now woman, elderly woman, but as a young girl, had to dig, was one of the diggers of the pit, had been forced to carry out that gruesome work. They had very distinct memories. They couldn't tell me the whole story of what happened, but it was really quite remarkable how they could zero in on pieces, on facets that they had seen, what they had seen, not the entire, they couldn't narrate what happened from beginning to end, but they could, in this instance here with this woman, she actually recognized one of the women, the Jewish woman in the photo. Oh yes, I saw her in the marketplace. I remember seeing her, and she remembered the soda fountain, and she remembered, it started to, just looking at these images, started to conjure up more and more. And here's another elderly man now who was a young peasant boy who watched everything unfold from the fields where he was working. And another witness, her family occupied a Jewish house, was given a Jewish house. And here we are walking closer to the actual crime scene through the forest towards the Polish estate. And there's some of the Yahad and Unum crew as we go into the actual site, and discovering, as I mentioned in the beginning, how the landscape is so transformed. It was a bizarre moment when we stood there and saw how the vegetation was disrupted, and the mounds and the kind of haloing of the earth that had been because of the victims had been disinterred during the Soviet exhumation in the late 80s, and bodies had been moved, bones had been moved, souls had been disturbed. And here we have bones that are just at the surface. This is a picture I took. We were shocked when we moved some of the leaves around and discovered vertebrae and skull fragments because of this exhumation that had occurred at the prosecutor in Zhytomyr conducted this in 1986. This is Skrovina's testimony, and this is another photograph I want to talk to you about in a moment. But let me just end now so we have time for questions on the issue of the shoes. The empty shoes and the crumpled coat exist in this image as questions, as gaps in knowledge. They remind us of the victims whom we cannot see, the many who were murdered and remained missing. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We can't turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of the victims waiting to be killed, other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officials. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones, that attest to the act of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions. I'd be really happy to take them. There's a lot more I can tell you, but I'd like to just leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lauer. I appreciate that very much. One student asked a question. He says the perpetrators were Ukrainian, and how I don't know if he knows that the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union at the time or so, but how did the Russian pogroms influence their actions, do you think?
It's a great question. I was just reading some testimony yesterday, and it was striking because the gentleman who was from Western Ukraine, Jewish victim, who gave testimony in 1985, said here at the Fortunoff Archive at Yale, he said, the reason why I'm giving this testimony is because I want to make a point. And he's saying this in 1985, a point that he thought was underappreciated. He said that when the Soviets came in, that the Soviet experience, and of course it was longer in this part of Ukraine because this was Soviet Ukraine going back to the 1920s. So this was a region that experienced the purges, the terror, the Stalinist terror, the Holodomor, the famine, terror famine. And this survivor was saying that the Soviet experience was so demoralizing, he said it killed us spiritually. And he attributes that experience of Soviet rule and the violence of that rule and what it instilled in the local population as far as a kind of revenge, seeking revenge against what was called the Judeo-Bolshevik kind of threat. He's very clear that this facilitated, this actually said the Soviets broke our spirits and the Germans killed us physically. So it was a spiritual kind of death under the Soviets and then a physical death under the Germans. But it was difficult for them to resist. And not just the Jews, by the way, he talks about the Poles as well, and how it was very difficult for them to resist the Germans in an organized way, and even with the kind of fortitude, with the kind of resolve, because of what they had experienced right before under the Soviets. And that also included for the Jews, the pogroms. This man had lost his entire family. They were beaten to death with blunt instruments and lead pipes by the local population before the Germans arrived, in an act, so-called act of revenge. Because of what the Bolsheviks had done. The Jews were scapegoated. They were blamed for that. So there is an important dynamic there that precedes this and is part of why this happened, how it was possible.
Well, thank you very much for answering that. I wanted to ask our colleague here, and you know Cheryl too, because Cheryl is a second generation and her family was in the situation where they were executed exactly as seen in the photograph and such. And Cheryl, so what do you think about this?
Yeah, my family's from Sarny, and that massacre killed 14 to 18,000 over 2 days. And as you said, we found no lists. We know our family didn't survive, but there's no list to say who is in that mass grave other than the number. So I had a question. Now, your book reads to me like a mystery novel. So it was fascinating how you put the pieces together. And I know you can't come out, or you have to come out to say who's in the picture, the victims. You're not positive. And I'm wondering, since the book was published in February, has anyone come forward to say they recognize some?
Cheryl, it's so good to see you again. It's been over a year. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. So you get it. You understand why it was hard to identify these victims. I think people, because we have these memorial events, which I so treasure as far as naming names, you know, each day on Yom HaShoah and individual names, and all the efforts that institutions have done to identify victims. And yet we still, especially for Ukraine, but also Belarus, we don't know their names. We don't know who they were. So, and that's of course what the genociders want to happen, that kind of disappearance, as it were, of people and of history and culture. Yeah, so I could not determine that with 100% certainty. I certainly was not going to go there and present, you know, I could only present that image as you saw. So it's a very challenging reality. It's a real reality check, as it were, in how, what are the limits of how we can do this history, right? I know that this is in Sarny, where your family's from, and also the case I was just talking about was actually Borislav. You probably know that area as well. That's not too far from Sarny. But yes, this is the case that we cannot always find the victims. But that search, I think, is part of the memorial process too. And it's these taking a source like this and trying to determine the who, what, where, when, that kind of detective work. I mean, it's not a mystery as far as we know what's going to happen here. We know the outcome, but there are many other mysteries, as it were, in this picture or in this source. Right. So there's more to be uncovered there. Other facets of the history and how we try to explain why, the big question of why. So can you tell me about the second part of your question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second part.
No, I was just wondering if since your
the response
book came out, did it spark something that somebody came forward?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. You were talking in the, I'm in the library and it's closing at 10 and the loudspeaker was going off. I don't know. I hope that didn't interfere with the presentation. Yes. You know what? The response to this has been incredible. Like nothing I've experienced in this particular way. I want to explain. I got a lot of emails on Hitler's Furies, but they were very different because I was dealing with female perpetrators. In this case, I have gotten a lot of emails from Jewish families, descendants of victims and of survivors, young people, young men and women in their 20s, who you know, that they want to carry on this work for their family. So maybe the family chapter or something. I found that I'm very happy about that, actually, to see this, you know, 20-somethings stopping and saying, what can we do? And also different scientists, because the book really tries to stress the different tools of research that are interdisciplinary, and how Holocaust studies draws on all these different tools for trying to do this detective work, or, you know, do this memorial work and write the history. And so a gentleman who's a specialist in DNA extraction at Hebrew University, who's volunteering his expertise and his resources and his equipment, and we're having an exchange about that. Is that something that we would want to do? And people who want to take this to another stage of research, a scientist in Madrid who has ground penetrating radar and wants to go to the site. You know, just people sharing their stories, their own family histories. But unfortunately, no one has come forward to say, you know, I recognize that person, or that may have been my family. I've had people come forward and say, I see other things in this photograph that you missed. So it's, you know, it's an interesting reaction as far as engaging people, different ages, different professions, in wanting to move this to into another chapter. And that I find very encouraging. And I feel like that's the kind of memorial work you know, if our research and our history writing, you know, moves beyond scholarship and the expansion of knowledge, if it has that kind of broader way of involving people. So I'm trying to figure out if I could organize something now and bring this community of people who've responded into another project. I'm just thinking about it now, so maybe we can continue this conversation.
Okay. Thank you.
Wendy, there's someone asked, is the boy from the family in the photograph, is he the one that's being murdered by the soldiers?
I don't know for sure. There's a striking resemblance. That little boy who's looking forward in the photograph, you know, he really does look like the boy who's also being shot. It's just that one is we see his face, he's looking forward, and the other one is kind of the back of his head.
Okay.
There weren't that many children. I think about 94 children were killed in this massacre. I mean, it's a lot, but not that many boys of that age with that hair, you know.
Right.
So.
Okay. There's also a gentleman, Stephen Bosnich, who's a PhD candidate, and he's asking, he's saying wonderful things about your book and such, but he says, can you talk a little bit about the book's title, please? You mentioned that you initially thought the killing site was a ravine, but it turned out to be a pit. Why use the title The Ravine? Does the choice speak at all to the tension between our initial perceptions of the photographed events and what actually occurred?
Well, he did a great job kind of answering the question. Yes, it does speak to this issue of what you see, you know, at first glance, and how you make certain assumptions given what you know historically is prevalent in this chapter, in this case, Ukraine, and the Holocaust by bullets, and that ravines were common sites for these massacres. The pit was already dug, as it were. They used that the ledge of the ravine, you know, for the victims to fall into, and then they would cover up the victims with the wall of the ravine. They might dynamite the ravine, or you know, or even the natural the rains and the erosion would serve as a way of covering up the victims. But no, yes, it in fact they did dig that pit. Now in Mirapol, there were 3 killing locations. And the first time I went there in 2014, I was taken to a ravine. There is a ravine in Mirapol. And I stood at the bottom of the ravine with a Ukrainian witness, the family. They were there during the war. And that's where the Germans, during this action, they call it, in October 41, they selected out the so-called specialists, the dentists, you know, the skilled laborers, the craftsmen, and some of their family members, and they were allowed to live, and they lived until January 42, so not very long. So for a few months. And because it was in the middle of winter and they couldn't dig into the soil in January 42, they brought those so-called specialists to this ravine in Mirapol and shot them there. So when I was in that ravine in Mirapol the first time, I was actually at another killing site, but it was not the one that we see in this photograph. And the ravine is just, it's an important metaphor as well. There's incredible literature now being Russian literature, a French scholar who's working on Russian poetry and Holocaust literature that invokes the ravine again and again as a kind of, maybe you can think of it as a bit of a black hole, as this kind of space in Ukraine's landscape where these victims perished, and then it's part of that haunting landscape, natural terrain of Ukraine, the use of the ravine.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lauer. I appreciate that. We are well over time, and I thank everybody for their patience, especially you. I know the guards are going to come and throw you out of the library very soon, but
It won't be the first time I've been thrown out of the library. Sorry.
It's now to end. I'm going to pass over my baton, as it were, to my friend and colleague, Cheryl Bronkesh, who is the president of the Phoenix Holocaust Association, upon whose board I have the pleasure and the honor to serve. And she's going to make an announcement about Genocide Awareness Week 10.
Well, and it's an exciting one. In 2022, Genocide Awareness Week will be moving to ASU, Arizona State University, and it will become a joint project with NAU, Northern Arizona University, and U of A. And we hope to see all of you in April 2022 as we continue the commitment of Genocide Awareness Week to education about the Holocaust and other genocides. And Father Dubois, who is the founder of Yahad in Unum, will kick off Genocide Awareness with a keynote address on April 4th, 2022. We all have our fingers crossed that that is going to be in person. So thank you to everyone who was watching, and thank you for your interest and support of Genocide Awareness Week.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Lauer. I really appreciate it. Good night, everybody, and thank you for your patience. And we'll see you tomorrow, and have a good evening. Thank you.